through generations, bridging the past and the present, and thereby affecting change for the future of our sport. We published our first story during the HOSR's virtual week in October of 2020. We published stories throughout the year, continuing the celebration of the 50th anniversary leading up to the 2021 regatta. The initiative's focus then turned from written stories to these Zoom story hours in an attempt to connect the community through the pandemic. Receiving such great feedback led us to the decision to continue these story hours every other month or so with guests of honor and themes that are important to us and timely. So in 2023, the HOSR Committee 50 is focusing on the historic events that allowed for the origins and shaping of Boathouse Row. We are telling the stories through the lens of existing clubs and organizations. Tonight, we will explore the circumstances that necessitated the establishment of the Schuylkill Navy, the oldest amateur sporting association in the US. A fascinating story of the river evolving and the intersection between private clubs and public lands and government that created a unique and sustainable relationships that would put Philadelphia and Boathouse Row on the map, making it a world-renowned rowing destination. The Schuylkill Navy's role is complex and it's seen its challenges over the years. We will hear tonight about how it's responsible for the rules of the racing that we know today, the manner in which it brought individual clubs together as a community, and the Commodore's role as chief arbiter. I did also want to highlight an initiative that has grown out of our 2023 agenda. In February, we held a story that focused on preserving the history of rowing. This has set the stage for a daunting challenge ahead. Dating back to the 1850s, rowing memorabilia has been damaged, lost, thrown away. Photos and banners have been water stained and crumbled, and attics are full of medals, letters, and paper clippings that have been left to families of rowing legends. That story hour confirmed that there are many, many people around the country and world working to save and archive our sports history, and that there's a need for an organized effort to lead and establish a collective digital archive linking physical repositories or mini museums throughout the world. So began the formation of an archive steering committee that's begun to meet regularly to hatch a plan and pool in additional resources to advance this effort. With a sense of urgency, the committee has set out to create better solutions for how to preserve what we have in Philadelphia, while at the same time working with counterparts across the country to connect these resources. So our overall goal is to preserve rowing materials and private collections and make them accessible to the rowing community and public. So just be on the lookout as we begin to identify private and club collections and provide resources and guidance to aid clubs and families in preservation and access for future generations. So I don't want to do all the talking tonight. We want this stellar lineup to do most of the talking. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Zooms can be a little tricky in this large format, but we stay with it because we really feel it's important to see one another, people's reactions and laughter and smiles. So the storytellers are not only sharing with us, but we are sharing with them in recognition and appreciation for their contributions and successes in our community. I have muted everyone to eliminate any type of background noise. You have the ability to unmute yourself at any time, but please be reminded to stay on mute if you have any background noise at all. Be sure to put your screen on gallery view. So if you're only seeing me right now, too close up, you're in speaker view. Scroll to the upper right-hand part of the screen and you'll see those options. Switch to gallery view, and then you can see lots of attendees at once. I encourage you to keep your chat room open and visible off to the side. You can use this chat room anytime to add comments to stories or ask questions of the speakers as they're sharing. In addition, everyone should be aware that I am recording this session, so it's available for those that are unable to join us tonight. And I will send it to each of you following tonight, so you can share it with others. All right, and as for the format, we will likely run to our 8:15 cut. I will turn it over to our evening's facilitators and fellow Committee 50 members, Rick Stellick and Christopher Doyle, who have put a tremendous amount of work into pulling together this information for you all tonight. They are going to introduce our first guest who will set the stage for our discussion of the Schuylkill Navy. And then Rick and Chris will walk us through the rise of the Schuylkill Navy, and we will be joined by past and present Commodores to round out the conversation. While you may pose questions in the chat room throughout the evening, we will reserve the last 15 minutes or so for the entire audience to add thoughts and questions verbally. You can always raise your hand or simply use an emoji to let me know that you would like to ask a question. So with that, Rick, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen. Can everybody hear me? I trust. I think this is going to be fascinating story, as Jen said. That what we have learned is, and I've learned much more about Schuylkill Navy than I ever knew possible. And there are like 10 or 12 different versions of the history of the Schuylkill Navy out there when you really start to dig into it. So we've tried to consolidate the interesting parts of that and get the best information we can. But really, the Schuylkill Navy and rowing in the United States, we're going to kind of start out in 1830 is kind of the starting point for both Philadelphia and around the country. But one of the parts we want to have the stage set for is the rowing in America around that time. And we couldn't think of a better person to talk about that for a few minutes than Bill Lanouette. Bill is the author of the book, and it's a long title, The Triumphs of the Amateurs, the Rise, Ruin, and Banishment of Professional Rowing in the Gilded Age. And what Bill is an expert on is the state of rowing, not only in Philadelphia, but also around the United States, particularly regarding amateurism and professionalism, which in many ways we'll come to understand as we move forward here, set the stage for the formation of the Schuylkill Navy in Philadelphia. And so very quickly, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and he's going to show some fascinating slides of not only Philadelphia, but around the country at that time frame and what was going on. So Bill, without further ado, please chime in. I hope. Bill? Do we lose Bill?
Bill needs to be unmuted.
He's on mute.
Now you can hear me. Apologize for speaking from notes, because if I don't, I'll never shut up. Okay, so I'm talking about rowing in America in 1858. When 9 amateur rowing clubs formed the Schuylkill Navy in 1858, the sport of rowing in America was split between a dozen famous professionals who raced for big stakes and small but growing number of amateurs who rowed for fun at clubs and colleges. Since then, rowing has changed in profound ways. Number 2, you got number 2? In 1834, a few clubs around the Battery in Manhattan formed the Castle Garden Amateur Boat Club Association. But they only held 2 regattas, spent most of their dues on showy silver prizes and champagne, and then disbanded. Other short-lived amateur rowing associations also formed in Newburgh, New York, in Charleston, South Carolina, where the plantation owners raced their slaves, in New York City, and in Jacksonville, Florida. Before 1858, there were a few notable regattas. We know, and you know, of one on the Schuylkill in 1838, at San Francisco in 1852, and at Chicago in Sandusky, Ohio in 1855. But these were one-time events. And in 1852, Harvard and Yale rowed the first intercollegiate regatta. But then in 1854, Boston sponsored the country's first city-run annual Independence Day regatta for both professionals and amateurs. A few other cities tried to follow, Worcester, Mass, Poughkeepsie, New York, Portland, Maine, but Boston became the biggest and best until it finally banned the professional rowers in 1897 and then later disbanded. Number 3. Before baseball, professional rowing was this country's most popular and lucrative sport. At this regatta shown on the Harlem River's Boathouse Row, note that in the lower right, how the betting pool odds were posted. Number 4. Professional regattas were notorious for fixed betting and drunken and sprawling and brawling crowds. Can you actually make out the sculler in the distance? 5. In 1867, Currier and Ives depicted the American Championship race between the professionals, James Hamill from Pittsburgh and Walter Brown from Portland, Maine. Number 6. In fours, in pairs, and in singles, 2 families dominated the professional rowing game. The Wards from Cornwall-on-Hudson, New York, and the Biglands from New York City. 7. John Bigland is at right, Barney Bigland at the top, in a photo taken at a Halifax regatta by Queen Victoria's official Canadian photographer. 8. He even included some beefcake in his photography. Number 9, Thomas Akins. In Philadelphia, painted the Schuylkill Navy's amateur champion, Max Schmidt, in 1871. 10. And Akins included himself in the portrait. 11. In 1872, Akins painted John and Barney Bigland racing in one of the very few professional races on the Schuylkill. In 1873, the National Association of Amateur Oarsmen was founded, today's U.S. rowing, to distance themselves from the wily professionals. 12. Both professionals and amateurs raced in the 1876 Centennial Regatta in Fairmount Park. 13. There, Canadian Edward Ned Hanlon won the professional singles. 14. And American Charles Courtney won the amateur single sculls. Then once Courtney turned professional, he and Hanlon rowed 3 notorious international races, clouded by betting fixes and sabotage, including cutting shells in 2. And that helped to discredit professional rowing. 15. But until the professionals were banned in the 1890s, they were sports celebrities featured on popular tobacco company trading cards. 16. 5 men in this professional 8 on the Harlem River appeared on those cards. And all of them appear when you look at road sculling a few frames from now. In the bow is Fred Plaisted,
Oh,
who bragged as a professional rower. I used to make more money throwing races than winning them. 17. Plaisted raced for years in San Francisco, sometimes under assumed names to help his odds, and then on the East Coast with and against the superstars, including the big ones. 18. When the professionals were so mistrusted that no city would sponsor their regattas, they tried rowing on land. In Madison Square Garden in 1888, Plaisted finished third after racing a road stroller for 6 hours a day for 6 days. Next. Plaisted coached crews at Bowdoin, Yale, Harvard, and Columbia before he moved to Philadelphia in the 1920s. Here he clowns around with Jack Kelly. Plaisted coached Schuylkill Navy rowers and rowed his single until his death in 1946 at age 96. 20. In conclusion, rowing in America has changed profoundly since 1858. First, from a professional to an amateur sport, and second, from a men's sport that today, when more women than men are rowing competitively. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. I think what Bill has provided is kind of a great background as to kind of the dichotomy which was going on around amateur and professional rowing at that time. And so now we're going to kind of segue into discussion of more specifically into the environment in Philadelphia. So Jen, if you could pull up the first slide. Okay, this is a view once again of rowing in Philadelphia. Probably you can see you can see the gazebo up there at the waterworks. You can see Girard Avenue in the background. I think, do we lose the? There we go. Okay. And you can see the folks on the West Bank and some of the other buildings which were there. I think we all know that the traffic on the Schuylkill was largely devoted to barge traffic at that time. And in 1830, of course, the dam was constructed, which really enabled us to have rowing as we know it today on the river. Next slide, Jen. This is a quick slide. It kind of reinforces what Bill was talking about. Before 1840, around the country, there were over 135 rowing clubs in the United States. And in Philadelphia, there were 15 before 1840, none of which exists today. They came and went with great frequency, and not a whole lot of information is available of them. But some of the later ones we'll be talking about, which formed the basis for the Schuylkill Navy in 1858, of course. So this is a kind of a timeline of activity in Philadelphia around 1840 and relative to the Fairmount Park, which we're going to talk about next. Because what's really important to understand, I think we all know, is that Boathouse Row, Schuylkill Navy's destiny and establishment was invariably tied very closely to Fairmount Park in the city of Philadelphia. Before 1850, Fairmount Park didn't exist. The area outside was pretty much outside the purview of and control of the city of Philadelphia. The waterworks had been established, a worldwide attraction under Frederick Grafe, the architect who designed it. But still, the area where Boathouse Row is today was kind of outside of the city. But in 1844 and 1854, the city acquired Lemon Hill and the Sedgway Estate, which of course we all are familiar with both of those areas. Lemon Hill still exists. And they also brought more land into the administrative control by statute of the city of Philadelphia. 1855, the city created 45 acres between Lemon Hill and the waterworks, where we are now, Boathouse Row, as common area for the citizens of Philadelphia. That there was a lot of controversy at that time because not everybody was thrilled with having this kind of ragtag group of men there who were in some areas kind of ruffians. These boathouses weren't really boathouses, were just shacks and considered to be fire traps. So very wisely, the existing clubs at that time, and there were 9 clubs, formed the Schuylkill Navy. But it's also interesting to note that I found that before the Schuylkill Navy was formed, there was also something called the Board of Control, which predated the Schuylkill Navy and was their early effort to create a group that they could work with the city. But the important thing was the founding fathers of the Schuylkill Navy recognized their need to have an organization that would represent Boathouse Row and the interests thereof to the city of Philadelphia. So in a sense, we weren't rolled over and eliminated because there were certain aspects of the city government, and particularly Frederick Grafe, who thought that the boathouses were kind of like a afterthought and really didn't fit in with his master plan of what what the area should look like adjacent to his beautiful area of the waterworks. In 1850, and of the original 9 clubs that were formed in 1858, only 2 we know of, and one being University Barge was the only one that remains from that original group and is still in existence today. And Undine joined very shortly after there in 1858, so almost simultaneously joined the Schuylkill Navy. So that group formed the initial 9 clubs back then, and only 1 or 2 of them survive to this day, as we know. 1859, the city kind of had it with the boathouses, and they condemned the existing boathouses, but they did in 1860 allow the 3 boathouses to remain, and they were Bachelors, Pacific, now then became Quaker City, and the Skating Club. And by statute, they allowed them to use the land and to build houses, and quickly other ones followed by application. Unfortunately, the Civil War intervened, and in a lot of areas really decimated rowing, quite understandably, as all the young men went off to war, and things changed a lot. Coming back to this, in 1868, after the war, Fairmount Park, as we know it today, and we'll see on the map, was created by a very defined area within the park confines. You read the statute, which we're going to look at very briefly, which created Fairmount Park, defined by meets and bounds the area of Fairmount Park, including the boathouses and the skating club, and they referred to us by name. But they also made it very clear in that statute that the boathouses were there at the pleasure of Fairmount Park. That is, we're now on their land, and we're supposed to abide by their regulations and their definitions of how we should behave, not only from a architectural standpoint, but also from a behavioral standpoint. And we'll touch on that shortly. 1878, another ordinance was passed in the city of Philadelphia, which kind of cemented and allowed the boathouses to remain, provided they were constructed in a Gothic style. That was very important to them because they wanted to have some continuity to it. And once again, Frederick Grafe Jr., the son of the founder of the waterworks engineer, insisted on that. And there are indications that they considered the Gothic style to represent the, how shall I say, the best attributes of people. And so that's why they chose the Gothic style. And for many years, the Gothic style did prevail. But as we all know, over the years, things have kind of morphed one way or the other from various architectural approaches. In 1882, the Schuylkill Navy applied for incorporation in the city of Philadelphia. And this is very significant because we do have the original documents, or copies, I should say, of them, where they outline exactly what the purpose of the Schuylkill Navy was. And rowing is very simple in their request for a incorporation. We are to promote the sport of rowing and amateur athletics in the city of Philadelphia. And from that, the city of Philadelphia approved the incorporation of the Schuylkill Navy. And so we became recognized as a real entity within the city of Philadelphia. The next major event, I think you can read down there, is in 1983, Boathouse Row, under the auspices of Schuylkill Navy and through the efforts of the Schuylkill Navy, which is important, was placed on the historic register, which enabled us to get in funding and preservation and the recognition of the city and of the country. A very significant event. Next slide, Jen. This is a map of the city, or excuse me, of the Fairmount Park in 1868 when it was established, the first meets and bounds thereof. And if you look on the slide to the right, you can barely see Boathouse Row between the dam and Girard Avenue. But that was the kind of the very earliest representations of the Fairmount Park. And it's interesting to note that it was a very elaborate system of park and trails and so forth. You can see the reservoir there, of course, now where the Art Museum now resides. And it's also interesting, there was an island, not Peter's Island, but there was an island below Girard Avenue Bridge there on the west bank. Next slide, Jen. This is I'll go through this quickly, but these are the early regulations that the city of Philadelphia through the Fairmount Park imposed on behavior in the park. And I'll just read a few of the highlights here. No person shall turn cattle, goats, swine, horses, or other animals loose in the park. No person shall carry firearms in the park. That's sure has changed. No person shall drive at a rate exceeding 7 miles per hour. Another change. No person shall take ice from the Schuylkill within the park without a said license and a commission thereof. So ice in that time frame of the history of the United States was quite valuable. So they wanted to protect ice being harvested on the Schuylkill River. No threatening, abusive, insulting, or indecent language shall be allowed in the park. Well, we know that one has come and gone over the years. No gaming shall be allowed. No person shall go to bathe within the park. I guess they hadn't thought about throwing toxins into the river at that time. No person shall fish or disturb the waterfowl in the park. No person shall have any musical, theatrical, or other entertainment without permission of the park commissioners. And for many, many years, even today, for certain events, and the Commodores can comment on this, you do have to work with the park commissioners and get their approval to have them. And then I think the last one of particular interest is no intoxicating liquor shall be allowed to be sold in the park. So they were very clear as to how they thought behavior should be in Fairmount Park, and that the boathouses should abide by them. This is a picture, we think around 1860 to 1865 of the state of the Boathouse Row along the park. And the area you can see, of course, Lemon Hill up at the top. Immediately all the way to the left is what was initially called the Skating Club, which is now occupied by PGRC, of course. And then there was a huge gap between that and the next boathouse. And these were kind of the early ramshackle structures that were there before we built the boathouses as we know them today. Okay, Jen, next one. This is a little hard to read, but I'll just go through this quickly. But this shows all the various clubs and their initiation dates into the Schuylkill Navy over the years. And if you look up at the very top, you'll see the original 9 clubs which formed the Schuylkill Navy in 1858. These were the beginnings of the Schuylkill Navy. They established a constitution. We have the earliest copy we have in one of those is 1865, I believe. But that was the first group of clubs which became part of the Schuylkill Navy. And you can see University Barge there. which was 1858, of course, to present, and also Undine, which is 1858 to the present. All these other clubs over the years have kind of come and gone, changed names and so forth. You recognize many of them down there. Most notably, and one of the next clubs to join was Sedgley in 1897, although they joined as an associate member. And after that, then the next club to join was PGRC. And I don't know, Sophie's on tonight, she'll probably comment on it, but PGRC, even though they were formed in 1938 in the old skating club, did not gain entry into the Schuylkill Navy until 1967. And there's a backstory to that, which I think is rather fascinating. But we can see that some of the clubs joined and then left and then joined again. So it's just been the history of the turnover and the turnover of the buildings. Jen, next slide, please. These are the flags, a couple versions of the flags of the Schuylkill Navy. These were found in archival information. What is curious about this, you can see that many of the boat clubs gradually changed their design of this flags. The flags were extremely important to Schuylkill Navy, not only the Commodore's flag, but also the various officers in the Schuylkill Navy, and the boats when they raced and were expected to fly their flags as part of their paraphernalia on the boats. And that was very important to have. What was curious to me anyway, as a member of Malta Boat Club, is that all the early flags of the Schuylkill Navy had Maltese crosses on them. And none of us have been able to find out any information why, what the reason was that they adopted the Maltese cross, but they were the emblematic on the early Schuylkill Navy flags for the Commodore, the Vice Commodore, and so forth. At some point, obviously, that was eliminated, and we'll see later on some of the flags that we now all recognize today. But once again, you can see how clubs went back and forth. Now going to turn it over to Chris Doyle, who's going to speak to one of the early versions of the Constitution of the Schuylkill Navy, which has some very information about how it was set up and the rules and regulations. So Chris, without further ado, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Rick. As we were preparing for this, we thought that it was important to recognize that the Schuylkill Navy today sometimes finds itself in an uncomfortable position of having to adjudicate disagreements among the clubs and even disagreements between the Navy and the clubs. And you know that sort of comes with the territory of this. But we thought that it would be good to step back for a minute and just look at the governance of the Schuylkill Navy as an empowering thing that is really for the public good of the river. And so that's what we wanted to focus on here. And if you look at the Constitution and the governance documents of the Navy, look at it from the perspective of a social scientist or an economist. And if they would read through this, they would say, what's happening here? And what it is, and I hope this doesn't sound too academic, but this is a voluntary association of private parties organizing to prevent the tragedy of the commons in a public resource over which they have no property rights. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. The tragedy of the commons is something that's referred to, it goes back hundreds, I think it began with Aristotle, but it has to do with the concept where if you have a public good or a publicly owned resource, eventually, in the absence of any property rights, private users of that resource will deplete it to the point where it will deteriorate. And that is what was happening. That's what inspired the founders of the Schuylkill Navy and the executives of the clubs that joined to do what they did. So what was it back in 1858 that kept these people awake at night? What were they so worried about the tragedy of the commons being the river? What was on their minds? Well, First is, which is really, I think, documented quite well in Dottie's book, is just the normal everyday traffic and usage of the river. And, boats running into each other, people not following the agreed upon gentlemanly rules of the river, and so on and so forth. And we have to remember there are no private property rights. So all of these rowers have no legal authority over any other rowers in this condition other than public shaming, which could have been done, but that was the only tool that they had. Secondly, they felt that the traffic of the river would need to be regulated to the extent that the clubs could not grow unless something was done to relieve that situation. Second, they believed as strongly as the Pennsylvania abolitionists believed in the abolishment of slavery. They believed in the abolishment of gambling. And the reason that they believed that is because they felt as though they were given a public trust to oversee the river. And from what Bill's photographs adequately show, they felt that gambling was like a cancer on the river, and that it would prevent the clubs from achieving any of their goals, from expanding the sport, and from organizing and adjudicating races. So that was kind of where they were coming from. And it's interesting to compare. The city could have done a couple of other things to accomplish the same result. The city could have, for example, auctioned off public access property rights to a private corporation for the highest bid. And they could have chosen that technique to govern the river. Another thing that they could have done is just bought the river access rights into whatever was the precursor of the Parks and Recreation Department, and they could have done it themselves. But thank goodness they didn't do that. Instead, the member clubs decided by themselves to form this voluntary association, and no, this was not forced on any club. It was voluntary at the time, and it was by the people who were the founding fathers. They were willing to relinquish some of their freedom of the usage of the river and their freedom of their own organization for the greater good of the continuing growing on the river. And I think that's kind of a very positive way to look about to think about the development of the Navy. And there are some other examples, as Bill was talking about. There are other examples of voluntary associations prior to the Schuylkill Navy, but they were very, very short-lived, and they were dealing with situations where there were very, very few private users of a public resource. Here we had many, many more than just 2 or 3 private uses. So it's interesting also to think about the term Navy for just a minute. They could have called themselves the Schuylkill Brotherhood or the Schuylkill Association, but they did. They carefully chose the word Navy, and that implies it implies authority, and it implies enforcement and self-defense, and that's really what is behind all of this. And as an example of that, and Rick will talk more about this in just a few minutes. The very first Commodore of the Schuylkill Navy was a military general, a famous military general, which lent a lot of formality and seriousness to the whole process of the initial charter and constitution. Now, if you go through this constitution, there's some very, very interesting things that all current rowers in Philadelphia especially should be aware of. It refers to monthly meetings beginning on the first Monday of every month. And that is a 165-year-old tradition. So, I've only been personally to a few Schuylkill Navy meetings myself, but I mean, really, anybody who walks into one of those meetings is continuing a 165-year-old wonderful tradition. And it continues to this day. At the time, Commodores were limited to a 1-year term. And as a matter of fact, the only exception to that until the latter part of the 20th century was during the Civil War, when there were a lot of bad things going on in the rowing community during the Civil War, a lot of challenges. And there was one Commodore who served that entire time. But other than that, when we look at the list of the Commodores, they were all single year terms. A lot of dispute and resolution was resolved by a supermajority vote of 2/3, which is a very interesting governance process, and that that really speaks to the camaraderie and the working for the common good. One club, one vote. Dues were $2 a month. So, it was certainly by terms of 1858, it was not very expensive, but it's important to bear in mind that at the time, the Schuylkill Navy did not charge entrance fees for their organized regattas. So for $2 a month, that covered not only the organization itself, but also the entrance fees for racing. There was also the critical importance of the log keepers, which the Constitution goes a long way in talking about. The log keepers were so important because it was important to know who was on the water at what time when disputes had to be disputed. So another aspect of this, Jen, can you go to the next slide, please? Is that associated with this whole era in the early part of the Schuylkill Navy is, thank goodness, we have some wonderful objects that still are with us today that speak about the pageantry and the regalia and the ceremony and the theater of rowing in Philadelphia. Could you get the next slide, Jen? This is an outline of the boat paths for the Commodore's Review. And this is, when you talk about pageantry, I mean, this must have been wonderful to watch. We actually do have some prints of early Commodore's reviews, which if we have time later, I think we can show them. Jen, next. And just, the original archives we have of many of the oldest organizations. For example, Falcon Barge Club was the first, I believe, to join the Schuylkill Navy. Jen, the next one. And just many wonderful objects of the period here that speak to the regalia. One more, Jen. And there's, do we still have these preserved? The Champion's Belt, the Caldwell Prize. Next, Jen. And eventually, of course, what happened, as Bill was talking about earlier, with the rise of national rowing in 1872, our course became the national course. And that, of course, expanded rowing nationally and expanded the prestige of the Schuylkill Navy greatly. One more. Next, Jen. Yeah, again, it's the flags. The whole culture of flags doesn't exist today, really, but at that time, it was really a big thing. Next. Okay, here, Rick, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about Mr. Prevost.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Just very quickly, I think, in our research, and it's available in many different sources, the list of the Commodores, which we'll see, but the very first Commodore of the Schuylkill Navy was named Charles M. Prevost from the Camilla Boat Club. And it appears that one of his criteria was you had to have a great beard and chops, their whisker chops, in order to be Commodore. But interesting, as you go into his relative bio, Charles Prevost eventually was a general in the Civil War. He was associated with the Pennsylvania Artillery. He was a distinguished citizen of Philadelphia, although he didn't start out in Philadelphia. He started out in Baltimore. But you can tell from his uniform, he was very proud of that. Now, we can find no indication in the bios if he ever rowed. or as to why they chose him to be the first Commodore. But I think it gets back to the points that have been made, that it was important for the Schuylkill Navy back then to establish some credibility with the city of Philadelphia. So I think having someone like Mr. Prevost as your Commodore gave some credibility, at least on the surface, to the importance of the Schuylkill Navy and what was attached to the various clubs and our standing within the city. So you can read this later on. I won't go into all the detail of it, but it was very interesting. And I did do some research on subsequent Commodores, and they all kind of had the same theme of being prominent citizens of Philadelphia. And here's a list of all the Commodores up to Cleet, and then also beyond that, we have next slide, which shows the Commodores after that. Of course, Cleet and John Hogan and Margaret and Paul and Bonnie. But I think it's important to realize that all the people have gone before, and I hope Liz is on the call tonight to talk about being the first woman Commodore in 1982, and of course, Bonnie being our current Commodore and all the things that she has dealt with and accomplished in her reign so far. But as it was pointed out, that they did essentially serve 1-year commitments, but that gradually changed over the years. This is, and we're going to ask the Commodores online tonight to expand upon this, certainly, but these are the Navy, Schuylkill Navy scope of things that they get involved in. And Chris, maybe you can comment on this list a little bit.
Sure. Well, the Commodores that are on this call would, of course, think this is a very short list, and they would have 100 things to add to it, all of which are probably headaches to them. But yes, generally speaking, these are the kinds of things that have grown as in the scope of the Schuylkill Navy. One interesting aspect of it was there are many references in the literature early on about the Schuylkill Rangers, which was a private police force, in effect, Schuylkill Navy had in the area of Fairmount Park. That was eventually replaced by a Fairmount Park police force, which many of us who are older remember when we were young. There were Fairmount Park police policing the area on horses throughout the day and night. But yes, so next slide, Jen.
Oh, one thing before you go on, Chris, I wanted to mention about Mr. Prevost. If anybody wishes to visit with him, he is available on a daily basis up at Mount Laurel Cemetery. So our first Commodore is still with us. I'm not sure exactly where his grave is, but he is up there. And so hopefully he's overlooking the Schuylkill River. Go ahead, Chris.
And joining us this evening, and again, with apologies about some of these dates. We may not be totally accurate on some of these dates, so we apologize for that. But these are the Commodores joining us tonight, and we are extremely grateful for your presence. And I think are we ready to go to Q&A now, Jen? So
Yes.
Let's
think we're gonna-
introduce some of our Commodores.
Yep. We're going to speak to some of our Commodores. I think we were going to go to Cleet first.
Hello,
Cleet.
everyone.
Hi, Cleet. Thanks for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
So I think Rick and Christopher had a distinct question to ask you, but we really just wanted, because you are a historian yourself and took a great deal of time to document and preserve a lot of these records and materials that have come from the past. And I think you did a great job of making those accessible to the rowing community. But let's talk about your time as Commodore and thoughts on challenges and how it relates back to some of the early history.
That's an interesting question. I found Chris's talk about governance the most interesting thing. I think probably the most important thing the Schuylkill Navy does that many of the listeners may not be fully aware of is these monthly meetings that still go on today, as Chris points out. So each club has a delegate. The delegates are appointed by the club, and the delegates elect the officers annually at the January meeting. And it's at the monthly meetings, which can get quite lively, as Bonnie and Paul can attest, that we discuss all the issues that Paul and Rick have been talking about, safety and the conduction of regattas, and relationships with the park and the city, etc. So the other part of it is, I think, for the Schuylkill Navy, is just building a sense of community. So with our events like the regattas, but also the Schuylkill Navy run, and we used to have a basketball league. And honestly, the basketball league was a little before my time, and I started in the late '80s, I guess. Rick, when did the basketball league demise? Do you remember?
I'm not exactly sure. What's interesting about the basketball league is, of course, they played their basketball games down at what was then Playstead Hall before the new one was built. But they were actually playing basketball games, and we have pictures of them on the third floor of Malta Boat Club. And we still have the remnants of the basketball net there. So the basketball league was a very big part of amateur off-season training for people along Boathouse Row, along with things in like the turkey trot too, where people train for that, and it was a very big event. But I'd like to complete. You can talk about it too, but you were very instrumental in preserving some of these wonderful artifacts, which are now at number 4, like the championship belt and so forth. But I'm sure it was a great challenge for you, and also for Joe Sweeney back then at that time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I'll mention that the Schuylkill Navy run in the basketball league were at a time when before head races weren't heard of back then. So it was a way of keeping athletes fit through the winter. But to get to your point, Rick, yeah. So the championship belt, is it possible to pull up a slide of the championship belt? It's pretty interesting. Rick, you know a little bit more about it than I do, maybe, but it dates back to Max. Help me out with the name, Max Schmidt, right?
Right, it was Max Schmidt in 1868. They established the championship belt of Philadelphia, which you can see there in the one photo on the left-hand side. And then through Cleat's efforts, that was restored, and that was presented at that time to the best sculler in Philadelphia, but also attracted national attention, and they would come in and race for that belt. And it's a beautiful piece of artwork, and it put, from an amateur standpoint, which is what is important about it, it was one of the many trophies that the Schuylkill Navy established to gain recognition around the country. And you can see in the other trophies, which still amazingly survived, along with the Caldwell Cup, which is immediately on all the way on the left, showing is a beautiful, beautiful trophy, which inside they kept the championship belt. And I think it'll be a wonderful thing. And the Caldwell Cup or box is on the right-hand side, to reestablish that for both men and women, of course, these days. But it is a part of our history. But I think it was a conscious effort on the part of the Schuylkill Navy to gain recognition for the amateurs in Philadelphia, as perhaps opposed to the professionals, which were still circulating, as Bill talked about in his talk.
So the championship belt, if you study it a little bit, each of those medallions represents the winner for that year. And so the winner's name and the year and perhaps the date of the competition is engraved on them. And you can see a good 30 of them there, and you flip the belt over. And as I remember, Rick, there's 10 more on the back side.
Right.
So again, it goes from 1860 something or other into the 1910s, 20s or so. Right?
Something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, Max Schmidt being the most famous recipient of that for like 6 or 7 years, who was immortalized by Thomas Akins, in his painting.
Right. And then the Caldwell Cup, as my memory is, the inscription on it says it was awarded to the club with the greatest display of oarsmanship at the annual regatta.
It was essentially a points trophy.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and the belt was from 1866 to the early 1900s. And yes, it's really magnificently preserved. Clete, you mentioned a minute ago about the community aspect of the Schuylkill Navy and its power in bringing the forces of the community together. One of the best examples I can think of that is what happened, and I believe, Bonnie, this was under your leadership, when the venue for the Stotesbury Cup Regatta had to be moved 48 hours before the race. And that is amazing. That has got to be one of the biggest operational triumphs in sports. That happened. And that really speaks, Clete, to what you're talking about. Tell us more about it, Bonnie.
Yeah, well, actually, it was Paul Horvath who is on the call.
Oh, sorry, Paul.
Was the Commodore under?
I'm easy sharing credit.
Well, you were Vice Commodore, right, Bonnie?
No, I was Commodore. Old Bonnie was Vice Commodore at that time. But yeah, no, but, yeah.
And, you know, it was, I will say this, and Paul can make an additional comment about it, but I think one of the beautiful things about that particular moment, and something worth saying, is that, you know, old Commodores, I won't say they don't die, I'll say they don't leave, and they never fade away. Because something that's really, I think, special about holding this seat is the fact that every person who has been in it recognizes the importance of it, the honor of it, and also, you know, the responsibility that comes with it. And I will say that that particular moment was only possible as a result of individuals, not only like John, but Margaret Meggs, who had been Commodore before Paul, Clete Graham, John Hogan. The inception of the need to move to the Cooper River came from Al Walklin in a call that took place on Tuesday and Wednesday, the day before. It was actually Al who first raised the notion of the rising Schuylkill rivers. And from that point on, it was, you know, all hands on deck with people who had a lot of experience to make that happen. And, you know, that I think is one of the more interesting elements of how that 2018 move happened.
Bonnie, maybe you could speak to, and we all know it, but in Philadelphia, but to the other audience, maybe out of town on our call, the number of regattas that you and your team and past teams have been involved in throughout the year. I mean, it's a huge list when you throw in the high schools and the colleges and so forth, but every one of them requires a Herculean effort on your part.
I'm actually going to defer to Paul Horvath on that one, because especially given the fact that he was the president of the Philadelphia Scholastic Rowing Association Flick Horvath Series, named in honor in part for his father. And Paul is so instrumental in the operations of all the regattas on the Schuylkill. I'll let him speak to the volume. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, well, we have it. There's 14 major regattas a year on the Schuylkill, including, you know, things like the head of the Schuylkill, and of course the Schuylkill Navy regattas, which is a Stotesbury Cup being the largest. There's a PSRA. There's a high school event. They run 6 events, and then we have other college events, the Murphy Cup, and things like that. We estimate there's about 40,000 plus people that race down the Schuylkill every year. Give or take. It could be a little bit even higher than that. So I think it's the largest volume regatta venue in the country, and maybe anywhere. It's a lot of activity. You know, like this weekend, we're going to run an event on Saturday with about close to 600 boats. I guess maybe 3,000 kids participating, all in one day. And we'll set it up starting tomorrow, do it all day Saturday for about 10, 11 hours, and then, you know, call it a day. So we are the busiest regatta venue anywhere. And it's remarkable. We have a great group of volunteers that keep showing up. We have a wonderful referee corps that helps us out. And to do it, I want to emphasize this. We have help from all of the clubs at Boathouse Row, because they provide us the launches, which we absolutely need to run the races. They provide us with drivers for the launches. They provide us with volunteers. So it's a real collaborative effort, and it's a testament to how much people love this sport, how much they see the benefit of helping out. And it goes back 150 years. The collaboration needed to make all of this happen. We all value this thing so highly. Here we are, we're all rowers, and we really enjoy learning about the history and learning about what we're doing, but it's the same theme repeated time and time again. And one thing to emphasize, the Schuylkill Navy is a 100% volunteer-driven organization, and there's a lot of hours involved to run this thing. So people really do sacrifice a lot of their time to do this because they feel it's really a worthwhile thing, and it's a real benefit to all the thousands of people that get to come down and race. And I mean, like you'll see on Saturday, all these kids. It's such a fun summer event, and the Stokesbury Cup is the same way. It's a high school event, and even like IDR we ran a couple of weeks ago, Independence Day Regatta weekend, 3-day event, thousands of people again, masters racing, high school kids racing, open and collegiate level athletes. So I mean, we really want to promote the sport. I think the Schuylkill Navy was organized to do that, and it has lived up to its mission, and we've helped promote it, and other regattas are doing a great job to make it work too.
And what's interesting, Paul, is if you look back in 1858 and you look at the very wonderful history books, which you've seen of the Schuylkill Navy, and in 1858, maybe there were 5 races, 6 races tops, something like that. And they were all challenge races, and they were turn races, which started at Turtle Rock, went up to Columbia and came back. And that's what it was. That was the whole Schuylkill Navy thing. So you compare that to what you just said,
right,
and how that has gone over the years, incrementally every year, year in, year out.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one thing I should have mentioned, so there's a total, if you include the college match racing, which happens on Saturday all spring, there's about 32 to 34 events every year on the Schuylkill. So that's an additional to the major regattas, which are large amount of crews from all over. So yeah, but you're right. It's just been the sport has grown. We've seen growth in the last 30 years, certainly in the high school level and then the master's level. I mean, I remember in the 1970s, when you finished rowing competitively, that was it. You just went and lived on steak and bourbon, and now people are like campaigning. They're out there in their 70s, 80s. They keep on going. So it's fun to see. It's really wonderful.
And I think that we are as the title says, we are the oldest organization in the United States, amateur organization, and it still exists. And that's an incredible accomplishment and everybody's concerns. So Jen, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I was going to say, Paul, and I know we've chatted about this before, and we've kind of touched on it tonight, but maybe you could expand upon, not only did the Schuylkill Navy fulfill its mission of, promoting amateur rowing, but, it was really, its first goal was to set rules for the river, right? And rules for racing, and how Philadelphia has made its mark really for the country, in its rules and where the rules, led us.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's an look at this organization that these guys created in the 1858 and continued. It did change the sport. It provided this formal framework, and the NAAO basically cribbed everything that the Schuylkill Navy was doing to form their national organization. And they continued that. I mean, their rule book was just basically what a lot of the rules of racing that was developed here in Philadelphia by the Schuylkill Navy. So they said, this is a good idea. This is what we should be doing. And let's work on making this an amateur sport. The gambling and the drinking on the bank wasn't the most family oriented thing and fun. So yeah, no, so we're the genesis. And the reality is NAAO was started here in Philadelphia and was headquartered here until 1985. So 100 years it sat right in Philadelphia, basically right next in the same building the Schuylkill Navy was. So the genesis of the organization of this sport started here. And it's a fun thing. I mean, this is sort of the birthplace of organized American rowing. And I mean, I don't want to, people always complain about, people who aren't from Philadelphia complain about Philadelphia. They say, oh, Philadelphia, you got your own everything. And you know what? Yes, we do. We have our own everything because I hate to say it, we sort of invented how all of this happens, and we are continuing it. We have this long chain of people who, keep stepping into the seats and acting in accordance with the rules and the tradition and everything that's happened before them. So we're really a consistent product, and I think that's appreciated by people, everybody who comes here and participates. And we love the sport, and Boathouse Row is such a dynamic, active area. It's a huge concentration of rowing, and so we're thrilled to be part of it. And I mean, being a Commodore was a lot of work, a lot of aggravation. It's a part of it's political. So anybody who's in a political position, half of your constituents are complaining, and half of your constituents think you're doing a good job. So you're kind of living in that space. But it was fun to do, and I'm still involved in the management of the Schuylkill Navy. I love regatta operations. I've had so much fun being involved in events. So it's just good to be here.
One thing, maybe Paul and Bonnie, you could comment on, we talked very early about about our relationship with the city of Philadelphia back in 1858 and 1860 and so forth, and how it was very tenuous. But you still continue that effort today to work with the city of Philadelphia. Now, it used to be Fairmount Park, now it's Parks and Recreations and so forth. So maybe you guys could talk a little bit about how that relationship works today and the importance of the Schuylkill Navy to represent our interests. And because it's gone beyond the 10 clubs of Boathouse Row, and now includes Gillen, it includes the upriver clubs, it includes the area on the West Bank, the canoeists, everybody. So maybe both you guys could just kind of comment about that ongoing relationship and what we're trying to do with that. Keep that.
Yeah, I'll take that one if that's okay, Paul, and then Cleet actually may have a comment on that as well. First of all, I'll just say that absolutely nobody in the city really knows quite what to make of us. And that goes all the way up to the mayor's office. Every mayor that I have known during my time with the Schuylkill Navy always makes the same comment, as do all the commissioners. They say, Commodore, that's like the best title. That seems to be a job that, a role that we'd like. But they're very fascinated really by the Schuylkill Navy because there's, again, sort of nothing quite like us. We predate the park, and we have a much less interrupted continuity than their own city administrations. And so consequently, it's the Schuylkill Navy that the city really turns to in order to fill in all the blanks that happen as a result of a change in administrations and a change in people. So whether it's figuring out the lights of Boathouse Row, or what's the backstory on this safety curtain that fell down in the midst of Ida, or can we really understand how it came to pass that these communication wires were on telephone poles at the grandstand, something that just came up in the past 2 weeks. The Schuylkill Navy has a stronger memory than Philadelphia Parks and Recreation. And we really do serve as almost like a quasi-governmental entity that manages more or less everything that happens between the Twin Stones and Fairmount Dam, certainly on the water, and anything that happens really on both of those drives on the east and west side. And one of the unusual things that most people don't recognize is that the city absolutely defers to the Schuylkill Navy with regard to how the water is being used for recreational amateur events entirely. So we go through an annual process that begins in the fall, where we work together to figure out what's going to be happening, day to day on the Schuylkill River. And to the extent that somebody would come in and say, hey, we'd like to run a big fishing tournament on the Schuylkill River between Twin Stones and Fairmount Dam, at least at this point in time, the city of Philadelphia would absolutely turn to the Schuylkill Navy and say, well, what's going on, at that time? And what do you think? Is this an event that can work within the calendar? Cleet really, he served the role so long as Commodore and definitely helped to forge that relationship. So Cleet, I'll defer to you if there's other things, but it's a huge part of the role of Commodore. I can say that, dealing because sort of in your non-paid position as a Parks and Recreation staff member, right, Clete?
Yeah,
You're on mute, Clete.
I'll just tell one story before Cleet gets on. That a few years ago, when Malta had its 125th anniversary, and I would happen to be president of Malta at that time, and we invited Mayor Good to come to our anniversary party. Much to our surprise, he came. And so he showed up that evening with his entourage, very nice gentleman with his wife and so forth. And they came up, and we're all sitting at tables on our third floor. We must have had 100 people there or more. And he was sitting at my table since I was president. And midway through the evening, he kind of leans over to me and says, "Well, what do you do here?" And it took me a moment to fathom what he was asking. I said, "Well, this is Malta Boat Club, Boathouse Row. We row here." And he said, "Oh, really? Where are the boats?" And I said, "Well, they're downstairs in the boat room. Would you like to see them?" And I took him down there, and he was just fascinated by, Boathouse Row. But I don't think, as to Bonnie's point, that, he was, not to pick on him, but many of the city administrators don't have that knowledge of what actually goes on Boathouse Row day to day. So it's a good point, Bonnie.
Clete, did you want to add to Bonnie's?
No, I really don't have anything to add to it. I thought what Bonnie said was point on.
Yeah, but I will say, one thing that I will say, that's an interesting story, Rick, and but I will say, when I said they don't really know what to make of us, in part it's because they really don't understand quite, our passion and enthusiasm and this uninterrupted thing. I will say, and I'll give credit to Clete because I think it really began under him. John Hogan, Margaret, Paul, and I have had a very consistent philosophy that says we need to change the situation wherein the city administrators and other partners in the city don't understand what we are doing. So I do think that from that point in time, all the way back when Mayor Good was the mayor, Rick, I think today the city has a much better appreciation for not only what we do, but more importantly, the importance of what we're doing. And certainly all of the work that everybody who has been involved in, for instance, Philadelphia City Rowing and some of the other efforts, not just exclusionary to Philadelphia City Rowing. I think every club, many schools, have really taken seriously the need to bring the transformational aspects of being on the water to a broader citizenry in Philadelphia. And because of that, the city has very much paid attention. And that too is a huge part of what the Schuylkill Navy does. And, I would be really remiss if I didn't say that the past two administrations have been unbelievably helpful in helping us on the heaviest lift. That was everyone's problem and no one's problem, which was getting the river dredged. And, we've come a long way since Mayor Good was standing in Malta Boat Club. That's for sure.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing. One thing I think, especially there's a lot of Boathouse Row people on this list. Right now, we're undergoing a major relighting project. And, you talk about how Boathouse Row was formed. They condemned the old houses and wanted to build new ones. And so this lighting of the Boathouse Row started in the mid-70s with the Rizzo administration. And there's been a lot of permutations over it, from screw-in kind of Christmas light bulbs to the modern LED. But one of the truths that we found out about probably more than a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, when Mike DeBerardinis was involved and others, was Boathouse Row is valuable to the city of Philadelphia because of its iconography. It's a wonderful looking collection of houses that the city does not have to manage with any tax money or management. The city owns 25 other houses in the park. Many of them are in disrepair. It's very difficult for the city to maintain historic buildings that aren't being used. And our buildings are being used, and the city likes us for that very much. And to the point of, they're spending $1 million now to redo the lighting because it is valuable to them. They love seeing people love seeing the Boathouse Row lights. People love the fact that the boathouses are maintained, and they're maintained because we manage them as a collective, and we do it because we love the sport of rowing, and we all raise money to run these houses. Every house takes, I don't know, $20,000 to $50,000 a year just to keep it alive, much less to rebuild these things. And some of the clubs are even actively right now pursuing some major rebuilding campaigns. So this is an important thing, and we have a good relationship with the city government because we have these touch points. They recognize it's important. Mike DeBerardinis was the managing director who said, basically, we have to get the river dredged because Boathouse Row will stop being used as boathouses, and these things will fall into disrepair. And we have to save it because of that, not necessarily because the city's so interested in having people boating. They're very interested in having Boathouse Row maintain itself. So it's an interesting point, and I think it's a good relationship.
Thank you for that. All good points there. Does anybody have any questions? And while you're unmuting yourself, is Liz Bergen on? I do not see you, Liz, so but I just don't want to overlook you. Okay. Any questions or final comments? All right, Christopher, Bill, or Rick, any final comments?
No, only thing I'll just say that thank you to everybody, Bill, for participating in this and setting the stage and all the research that went on this. But one thing I have found in my career, you know, rowing around the country and then rowing overseas, and Jim Dietz, you're on the call, I think you can talk about this, but anywhere you go, if you mention Philadelphia and Boathouse Row, people recognize that. And I think that's a real tribute to what Paul was just saying, and Bonnie, how we've established this relationship and this long history of amateur rowing. They may not get the name of the Schuylkill River right. They may pronounce it the Schuylkill River or something like that, but they know Boathouse Row. And somebody today asked me, how did Boathouse Row get the name Boathouse Row? I really don't know, but I think it just is emblematic of what we are. And it's worldwide, and it's easily recognizable in the list of Olympic champions and national champions and so forth that we've produced from the Schuylkill Navy system, if you will, starting back with a few clubs where, you know, you just rowed for one club and that was it, to what we have today with the women's rowing and the diversity and so forth is just a wonderful accomplishment. So I know we all sometimes are not appreciative, but I think we all on the HOSR committee, our hats off to the Schuylkill Navy administrators. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you to this entire Committee 50 and Jen and all the great work that you're doing. It's such important work for our community, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you so, so much.
One thing I'll say too, finally, another plug for archiving, but recently several of us visited the Seaport Museum in Philadelphia and met with their archiving staff. And there are down there, if anybody really wants to get into it, we're hoping to identify these records and make them more accessible, but there are 110 boxes down at the Seaport Museum of records listed as Schuylkill Navy.
Yeah.
And it's a huge collection. And I'll hats off to our beloved Joe Sweeney, who got many of those records down there in his association with the Fairmount Park. And thank God that, and I'm sure Cleet, you were involved in that, those records were saved before they disappeared over the years. But, you know, once again, there's all sorts of wonderful records down there. If you want to know any more information about the Schuylkill Navy and other clubs, we can certainly help you out with that. So throw that offer out to anybody who wants more information based on the research and the archiving we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I would just further that plug by saying that if you are a Boathouse Row member, pass along this recording to your fellow club members. And if you are involved in a club, you know, in any part of the country, you know, take note of its history, because I think the more we know about it, the more we understand the decisions that are being made every day, and the more that we can come together as a community. So I want to echo thanks, huge thanks to Bill, to Rick, to Christopher, to Cleet, to Paul and Bonnie for sharing their knowledge and their experience with us tonight. You can check out any of our past story hours on our YouTube page. As a registrant tonight, you'll each get a link to this recording and the link to the past recordings. So we want to thank you for spending your time with us this evening. Mark your calendars. We'll probably have our next story hour in September. We'll continue this History of Boathouse Row series. And mark your calendars for the 53rd HOSR, October 28th and 29th. Registration is now open. Our thoughts are always, our doors are always open, and thoughts are always welcome on subjects that you would like to hear about. So you can always reach out to us at info@hosr.org. And then just a final plug, I think, for the Schuylkill Navy as well. Check out their website and all the things that they do. I mean, we just briefly touched at the very end there about how they are still huge supporters of the high performance team. So you can get to know more about that there as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you all very soon. Be safe. Have a wonderful rest of the summer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thanks to
Bye.
everyone. Nice
See you.
job.
Bye,
Yeah,
everyone.
carefully.
Lovely.
Bye, everybody. Good to
Thank
see
you.
you all.